Hey there, I'm Hillary, and this is part 6 in our series on building a wood-framed raised bed garden. In this video, we start the drip irrigation installation process. We break drip irrigation into 2 videos because there's a lot to discuss there, and we really want to take you step by step through the process so that you can do it all on your own. In this first video, we install the manifold off of the hose bib and our timer, as well as the header tubing, so the main line that brings the water from the hose bib or hose spigot to your garden. In part 2, we'll install the drip lines.
Okay, let's talk about drip irrigation. When you're putting in drip irrigation for a garden, there's 2 main routes you can go. One is to tap into the water main that goes to your house. People usually do that for big irrigation systems for an entire property. It's kind of complicated, expensive, and something a professional should probably do. The other option is to just run a system right off a spigot on your house or a spigot out in your garden, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So one of the first things you're going to need to figure out when you put in a drip irrigation system is the path from the water source to the garden. At most sites, you're going to be able to tap into your spigot and then run underneath maybe a narrow pathway or around your patio and find a line out to your garden. Most of the pipe will be buried underground. It's usually pretty easy. At this site, we actually have a really wide driveway in place. So we went ahead of time and dug underneath the driveway to install our mainline tubing. I'll show you the technique for digging underneath a sidewalk here in a few minutes, and we'll do it on a more traditional 2-foot wide pathway. Okay, so for this site, we've come on the other side of the driveway. This is our mainline tubing, and I'm basically going to just connect a longer piece, bury it underground, and bring it out to the short edges of my bed. The main line is going to run along this side of these 2 beds, come up inside the bed, and the drip lines are going to sit on top of the surface of the soil. So we're going to break this video into 2 parts. One is getting the main part of the system in place, then we'll bring the soil in, and then we'll show you how to put the drip tapes on. Okay, let's talk a little more about getting water from the water source out to your garden site. Some houses, you might not have any barriers in the way. You can just run straight from the water source out to your garden. At a lot of places, there might be a pathway or a patio or something that you want to go underneath. This is a concrete pathway. It's a couple feet wide. All I did was dig a hole on this side where I have more room, dig a hole on this side. And then I used a piece of rebar that was long enough to go all the way underneath and basically just hammered it under my sidewalk, made a hole, kind of widened that. And then I basically just have a trench underneath the pathway. I'm going to take my main line, put a little piece of tape on the end so I don't get a bunch of dirt inside of it. And then hopefully it'll just go right underneath and there you go. No trip hazard, and you can connect your water and keep running out to your garden. So we've got a spigot on the house here. This spigot has a built-in backflow preventer, which I can see because of this cap on the top. And what that means is when the water shuts off, a little bit of water will leak out of here, and that prevents anything that comes into your irrigation system from going back into your house. They build these because you don't want water that comes into an irrigation system, maybe gets fertilizer mixed into it or some other debris to come into your water pipe and then you drink it on accident. If your spigot doesn't have a built-in backflow preventer, you'll want to install one. They're really easy to get, and basically it just threads right onto the bottom of your spigot like this. Because I don't need to install a backflow preventer, the first piece of my system is going to be this, what's called a Y valve. And this isn't an essential piece, but this allows me to have access to the water even when my system is set up. So in case I want to run a hose from the spigot, I don't have to disconnect my irrigation system. I definitely recommend putting on a Y valve, or they even have 4-way splitters that you can put on your spigot so you can still use the water and not disrupt your drip irrigation system. So I'm going to install this Y valve. 2 things to keep in mind. One, make sure that it still has a washer in it. A lot of times you buy irrigation fittings and the washer can fall out. If it does, it'll leak. So this one still has the washer, which I can see this black plastic ring in here. The other thing to note is that these threads on the Y valve and the threads in the spigot are both metal. So I'm going to put plumber's tape on for that connection. Again, that's just a way to help prevent leaks. So plumber's tape is something you wrap around the threads and it just tightens up that seal. So when you're installing plumber's tape, you want to make sure that you wrap it in the direction of the threads so that it tightens as you put your Y valve or other piece on. If you wrap it the wrong way, it'll get loosened and bunch up as you try to put on your new threads. There we go. Now, it's a good idea to test each part of your irrigation system as you install it to make sure that it works, especially here at the spigot. So I'm going to close both of these valves and make sure I don't have any leaks. Oop, looks like I have a leak. I'm going to tighten that up a little bit. Okay, one of the most important tools when you're installing drip irrigation, a pair of channel locks. You actually want 2 pairs of locks when you're installing the drip tapes, but for this, I'm just going to get it on here and do a turn until my leak stops. You never want to over tighten fittings because you can break them. But sometimes they need to be more than hand tight. No leaks. All right, so the next piece in my system is this battery operated timer. You can get timers that plug into a wall. You can get smart timers that connect to your phone. This is a really simple low-tech timer. It has a digital screen and runs on a 9-volt battery. A 9-volt battery usually lasts 1 or 2 years in one of these because it doesn't use that much power. I like to use timers like this because they're inexpensive and they're reliable. There's not much that can go wrong. And so I'm going to just connect this right to my Y valve. Because I'm still connecting to metal threads, I'm going to go ahead and just put some more plumber's tape on here. Okay, so at this point I know that my Y valve and my timer don't leak. And so now the valve for the irrigation system really lives inside of the timer. So this spigot is going to stay on all summer. I also don't need to keep testing because at this point, water will always be coming through here. But we'll run the whole system when it's assembled and check every single part for leaks and tighten them up at that point if we need to. The next piece I'm going to install is called a pressure regulator, also called a pressure reducer. Your pressure regulator will say the pounds per square inch it will let through. So this says 10 psi. Which means it'll reduce the water pressure from my house water line down to 10 psi. This is really important because drip lines are rated for different psi, which means the amount of water they can actually handle to drip properly. If you don't install a pressure reducer, you'll have water shooting out of your drip lines. They may pop off, they may break. So it's a really important part. You want to check and make sure that your pressure regulator and the drip tapes you're using are compatible. Now, they make pressure regulators in just about any PSI you can dream of. This is a 10, this is a 20. I'm going to use the 10 because the drip tapes I'm using have a max pressure of 15 PSI. The water coming out of my house is probably about 50 PSI. Because this has plastic threads and this has plastic threads, I'm not going to put any plumber's tape on because it'll make a really nice connection. I'm going to check my washers there, so I'm just going to put this right on my timer. The next piece, this is called a filter. This is a T filter. And basically what it does is it has a piece that screws out and it has a filter in here. There are particulates in your water, so this prevents them from getting in your drip tapes and clogging them up. You may only need to clean this out once a year or less. Some homes have a lot more particulates in their water because of the water system that you're using. So you want to just check this a couple times during the year, especially if your irrigation system stops working. this is a good place to look and see if it's all clogged up. For now, I'm just going to make sure the cap is screwed on tight. This also has plastic threads to plastic threads, so I'm not going to use any plumber's tape. It also has a washer, which is in there, and I'm just going to screw it on. So this last piece I'm going to connect before I get to the main line tubing is basically just a fitting that connects from my filter to the main line tubing. When you're getting fittings for your drip irrigation system, you're going to want to make sure all the fittings are compatible with the mainline tubing diameter you get. So usually you're going to buy the same brand for everything, the fittings and the tubing. Otherwise they may not be compatible. This basically just has female threads with a washer on one end and a fitting that screws down. It's called Easy Lock, and it screws down onto the mainline tubing like this, and that's what holds it in place. So again, it's a plastic thread. This is a plastic thread. I can just screw this on, hand tight, and I'm going to turn it so it faces down, and then I'm just going to connect my mainline tubing. Now that I've put all the fittings on the spigot and run the mainline under the driveway, I'm going to bury the mainline tubing along this edge of the driveway over to the corner of my raised bed and underground along the outside edge of this raised bed. I find it's much better to run tubing even when it's buried along edges, so you always know where it is, and so it's in a place where you're less likely to be digging. If you run it through the middle of a landscaping bed or the lawn, it's much more likely to get severed when someone's out digging in the garden.
At this point, you might be wondering why we don't plan to run the main line to that first corner of the bed, the one closest to the driveway. You could definitely do that, and that is absolutely the path of least resistance. In our opinion, it's best practice to surface the main line in the least visible part of the bed, and in this case, that was the back of the beds. Now, in some situations, that might not be feasible, and that's totally fine.
All right, so I've got my mainline tubing coming from the driveway. I'm going to put this piece on. This is a coupler, basically just a straight piece that allows you to connect two disconnected pieces of mainline tubing. Really handy to have. It's really nice to have extras of these when you order pieces, because if you ever cut your line on accident, you can just trim it and put one of these in and repair it really quickly. Now the tubing I'm using is 1/2 inch diameter mainline tubing. You can get 3/4 inch diameter or pretty much any inch diameter. This is made out of polyethylene plastic, so it's pretty flexible. It doesn't leach. It's a really nice option for tubing. You can also use PVC, but PVC is rigid, and if you crack it, it's more difficult to patch. It's more time consuming to install, and it's also not flexible. So one of the nice things about polyethylene is you don't have to bury it very deep. I'm only going to bury it a couple inches. It shouldn't be a problem, because if there is some water in it when it gets cold, it can flex a little bit, but we also drain the system at the end of each season, so there's not a lot of water sitting in it. Because it's shallow, you can puncture it, but if you do, it's very easy to fix because you don't have to dig very deep. So I find it's better to bury the tubing just a couple inches underground, again along an edge where you're not likely to dig, and then it's really obvious because there'll be pooling if anything ever happens to the tubing, and you can easily get to it and fix it. So when you're picking out fittings to install, you can get fittings like this, which are called Easy Lock, and they basically hand tighten. Or you can get compression fittings. Compression fittings, when you push them on, the tubing basically gets stuck inside. They're a little bit less expensive, possibly. They're more durable, but they also make installing irrigation very difficult, because if you ever do anything wrong, you have to cut it out because you can't easily get the tubing back out of it. I've never had a problem with these fittings, so I prefer to use them. So I'm basically just going to run this in my trench, and when I get to places where it gets a little bit squirrely, I'll put a landscaping pin. This is a 6-inch landscaping pin to hold the tubing in place so it doesn't move around on me. When I get to the corner of my garden bed, I have two options. I can cut the main line and put in an elbow. That'll make a straight 90-degree angle. Or here, because it's not really going to be a problem, I'm just going to do a curve of my tubing, and that's just less cuts, less fittings. That means less potential places for the line to fail. I'm just going to curve it here instead of cutting it and putting in a 90-degree angle, and then I'm going to run it along the long side of my garden bed. Okay, so now I'm at the back side of my garden bed, and this is where I wanted to bring up my header inside to attach my drip lines. I'm going to arc it around this corner too, and I'm just going to dig underneath the bed so I can feed it underneath. So I'm going to cut it here, and I'm going to put a 90-degree elbow on so I can get the mainline tubing directed inside my bed. So I'm going to come around the back side of this garden bed, and I want this main line to continue running to my second bed, but I also want it to come inside of this. So at this corner, I'm going to cut the main line and install this T fitting. And that way I can connect a piece that runs to the second bed, but I can also bring it inside of this bed. So I'm going to dig out underneath this corner, put in a T, and then I'll show you how to bring it up to the top of your bed inside. When you're installing drip irrigation, you're going to need something to cut the tubing. I like to use some big snips like this. You can use scissors or a knife, but I find that these cut through the pipe really easily and make a nice clean edge. So I got my T. I'm going to connect this so I can run over to my second garden bed. And then I'm going to take this short piece, it's about a 6-inch piece, I'm going to put it on this end, and this is going to run into the garden bed. I'm going to put another elbow on that far end so that it can come up vertically into the bed. Okay, so then now that I've got this coming into my bed, I'm just going to put on an elbow. And that way I can put on a piece coming up vertically to the top of the bed. So to come up vertically in the bed, I'm going to cut about a 14-inch piece because my bed is 16.5 inches tall. That way I'll have room to put an elbow on without coming above the top of the bed. You can measure that or eyeball it. You have a little bit of flexibility when working with this tubing. So now another elbow at the top of this vertical piece is going to allow me to run a piece of main line the short direction across my bed. So then now the last piece of main line for this bed is going to run like this across the top of my bed, the short direction. I'm going to cut it a little bit short so that I can put a flush cap on. This allows me to unscrew the cap and run water through the system to flush out any dirt that gets in it. Also just prevents water from gushing out the end. It needs to have some sort of cap, and this is just the type I prefer to use. So when you're installing your tubing, before you've run water through it, it's going to be kind of squirrely and bending all over the place. You have a couple options. You can screw it into place with some pipe clamps, but what I've found is that once you've run water through the system, the water pressure will force it to go straight and it'll sit in place all by itself. So I'm just gonna let this kind of sit tucked behind the bed. We're gonna fill the bed with soil and then install the drip lines. I could install the drip lines right now, but they'd kind of just be in the way as we were doing soil import. So I like to break it up into 2 phases, finish up the header, get it out of the way, fill the bed, and then put on my drip lines. So here's my second garden bed. I'm gonna run the header just like I did to the first, and I'm gonna put a T in at this corner. I'm choosing to run the header all the way to the end of the bed because I believe another garden bed will be added at some point in the future. So it's just an easy way to stub out your irrigation for future expansions. So you could put an elbow in here and have the main line end right here, but I'm gonna put in a T, just like I did in the first bed, run my irrigation line to here, and put a flush cap here for now. The added advantage of having the line end down low with a flush cap is it gives you a low point in your system to open up at the end of the season and let the water drain out.
As we've mentioned before, we're huge fans of drip tape. But regardless of the type of drip lines you want to use to water your garden, you can set up your main line the same way to bring water to your site.
And that's it.